Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. We are on day 86 of self-quarantine. And for those of you who've been listening to the show over the last several weeks, you know that I have been in Arizona staying at my grandparents' home. My grandparents passed away a few years ago, and we are grateful to be able to come to this space, with our family, to take better care of family members in particular. And I have been here really in shock over the last few days, because as of right now, right this very moment, we are under evacuation notice. Just a couple of blocks away from this home, all of the homes are evacuating because there is a wildfire that is spreading throughout the mountains that are just a couple of miles away. In the last couple of days, I have seen so many different types of wildlife go into the backyard, into the front, from javelinas to coyotes to wild lions. It's definitely climate change, and this is due to the soaring temperatures. It's unfortunately not the first evacuation I've had to deal with in my lifetime, or even in the last 10 years, because of climate change. I was in Greece just a couple of years ago, and they had their worst wildfire in history that killed hundreds of lives and became a national political story that arguably changed governments in Greece. I was there evacuating. I was in New York during Sandy, living on the Lower East Side, and was evacuated from my home because we didn't have power or water. And so many people have not been able to recover from Sandy since then. So here I am in the last decade. Those are just a few situations off the top of my head. Here I am in this home, ready for evacuation, but the show must go on because the world is actually on fire. We have global uprisings. There's momentous shift happening in our politics, and it's hard to keep up. It's hard for all of us to keep up. News is really happening so quickly, and I think a lot of folks are missing news that probably would be on the prime time, like fires here, because there is other news that is monumental and global in scale. So while we deal with COVID, while I'm in Arizona, which is now also the epicenter of COVID, because the Governor Ducey decided to open up business prematurely against expert advice, we now see a rise in COVID rates. Hospitals are over capacity, and there is a fire outside of my window. Not to mention the protests that continue, the protests over police brutality, the protests over austerity that has hurt so many communities of color and people on the front lines and indigenous people. These protests are a symbol of a failed system of capitalist-led government. But today's show is about the future. Today's show is what we do right now with what we have, how we take over our government so that we are never in this situation again as a collective. Today's show is about what it means to elect leaders that have the courage to stand up and to voice outrage and have actual plans that are going to shift policies so that we deal with climate change head on as an emergency, because it is literally an emergency right now as I sit here. Today's show is not about reform. Today's show is not about passing legislation to hold bad actors accountable. Today's show is about what it means to drastically shift our government because we have no choice at this point. Today's show is about democracy. Our democracy is eroding. We have elections that we, as the United States, would mock other countries for. Our elections in our own states are not being conducted fairly with proper oversight. What happens in the United States, of course, has a global effect. We are seeing it on the streets. We are seeing how the Black Lives Movement has turned into a global movement. There are streets across Europe being flooded with people standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter America and against colonialism. But this show is also about silence and courage. I've noticed something in the last couple of years from progressive leaders, and I want to talk about it head on. And I have been guilty myself. If we want to have more progressives in Congress and in elected office, we must fundamentally understand the challenges that they face, especially if they're women, especially if they're women of color. We need to understand the systemic issues that they face in their real lives, the sacrifices they are making when they are running for office, and the added challenges that they're facing while they're running for Congress. So what does that mean? That means if you decide that you want to run for office and you come from a working class background, my guess is you do not have a bunch of rich friends that you can call up for maxed out checks to get your campaign up and off the ground. My guess is that you're not going to have institutions swoop in and help you raise the money or get you the press. My guess is the press isn't even going to cover you. Maybe ever, but definitely not before you get some big endorsements. Meanwhile, so many of these people who are courageously stepping up and running for office are doing so without taking work or cutting back on work or still working. They're not paying their student loans. They're not paying their car bills, their insurance bills. They're defaulting. They're not paying their mortgages if they're so lucky to have mortgages. They are going into debt as they courageously step up and run for office with very little assistance, with so much to prove, all for us. But we have to think about, there are people in office right now who are very lonely, progressives in office that are very lonely, and they become more powerful if they have allies in Congress with them, in the Senate with them, in the city council with them. People who are not just branded progressives, but people who don't take the corporate money, don't take the police union money, don't vote for the police union budgets, don't vote for the military industrial complex expanding their powers and their bank accounts. It is a very lonely place to be in government right now if you are a true progressive. And you only become a stronger progressive if there are other progressives there to back you up. But that means we as a collective have a duty to support these candidates earlier. The litmus tests that the institutions put out there are always based on fundraising. Have you raised $300,000 in the first 2 months? Oh, you haven't? We can't support you. That's the establishment. But I'm hearing similar style litmus tests about seeing whether or not a candidate is viable. What does that mean? What does viability mean? Doesn't the candidate become more viable if they get that support earlier? So I am challenging everyone, not just those in office, not just big leaders, not just organizations. I'm challenging everybody to support these candidates, especially if they don't have all the money flowing, and support them early. Because the sooner they can get up and off the ground as candidates, the stronger their campaigns become. The earlier people learn about them, they can get their name out there, their ideas out there. And if they're not in COVID, they can knock on doors. But if these endorsements are coming in late like I am seeing right now, and thank goodness there are progressives endorsing. I do not want to discredit that. I think it's commendable that people are using their leadership to go out there and endorse other leaders. But we can do better. The earlier you endorse, that candidate, that campaign can fund more staff, can put out more materials, can possibly quit their job and do it full time. The earlier that they receive a flood of money, the way that so many progressives have seen in the last few years, those small dollar donations, the earlier that that happens, the stronger the campaign. Because a lot of it is flooding in at the end, if it's flooding in at the end, when the endorsements roll in, when the press starts to come. But it might not be enough because the establishment has their money the whole time. The establishment has the press the whole time. And the more times the establishment's name is said over and over and hits a home with a mail piece or an advertisement, that name is more familiar to the voter. So the earlier people learn about the progressive, which costs some money, the more that progressive challenges the establishment. So my lesson for today is ask your progressive leaders who are elected to endorse early. I understand it's politics. I understand there's a lot of dynamics and folks sometimes can't do it early for a reason, but I also want to give shout outs to people like Representative Ro Khanna. He endorses early. Marianne Williamson endorses early. This is the kind of leadership that we need. And we should be endorsing candidates that really need that help at a critical moment. And for you guys looking to give money, I also urge you to support candidates who may not be getting the national love. I'm not saying that everybody doesn't deserve small dollar donations and support, and some of these races are super tight, especially in the end. But don't forget the folks out there who may not be getting the coalition support. And when I say coalition, I mean organizations will come out and support a candidate at some point, and then another organization will, and then they'll pitch press, and then elected officials will come out and endorse, and that is fantastic, and that is how we win. But I urge you guys to please support candidates who really need the love right now. It's been a hard road. Some of these candidates have been running for 16 months or more. Some of them haven't worked. They're going into debt, and they did not expect COVID to come in. They expected to have strong door-to-door elections and campaigns, and now it's going to be very hard. Now something could happen. I mean, listen, an uprising took place in less than a week. The world can shift, politics can shift so quickly. But the way that we need to deal with the climate emergency is the way that we need to deal with supporting our progressives courageously running right now. To deal with these crises, we need people who understand the crisis of survival in office, to articulate that, to vote that way, to say and reject oil money and military industrial complex money, war money, police union money, to go bolder, not call for reform, but transformational change. We need people who know what it feels like to have their friends and family locked up for no reason at all. We need people who know what it feels like to not be able to afford to go to college or go broke as a result. We need people who know what it feels like to be denied health care, medical care, because they can't afford to get something treated. We need people who know what it feels like to not be able to pay rent, to be homeless. These are Americans. These are the crises that are in front of us. We need people that know these crises firsthand to go in there and fight for us in Congress. But that means we have to support them. It's all a crisis now. It's all hands on deck. So with that, we have a pretty extraordinary show today. We have the one, the only Cori Bush. Cori Bush, of course, is running for Missouri's 1st District, congressional district. And then we have Lauren Ashcraft, who is running against a congresswoman in New York who I think New Yorkers are very, very familiar with. She's been challenged a few times, but it's a crazy race. Lauren Ashcraft is running to represent me in my district. And then we talk about electoral reform with Jennifer Cohn, she is an advocate for paper ballots. And after the story we tell you about Georgia, I think you probably will be too. The crisis is here, right here, outside our doors, right now. All hands on deck. I want to thank you all for supporting our show. As you know, these are crazy times. So it is my duty, I feel, as a citizen of the world, to try to present you with the best information. So please feel free to email me at thenomikishow@gmail.com with ideas, because there is a lot of news that we are missing, and I want to hear from you. Continuing our series highlighting working progressive women running for Congress, trying to transform the priorities of Congress, the stories reflected in Congress. Of course, that is the work of Matriarch, our mission as an organization. We are highlighting somebody that is probably very familiar to many of you. Her name is Cori Bush. She is running for Missouri's 1st District against a 20-year incumbent, Lacey Clay. And she ran last time around, scared the crap out of him, but she was not scared off. And she decided, you know what? I'm coming back for more. And she's been building a movement amidst possibly the craziest of elections in many lifetimes, with COVID happening at once, with uprisings happening. Cori, thank you for running. Thank you for joining us. I know it's been a very busy week for you. You were just endorsed by Bernie Sanders, who you're a surrogate for. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be on your show. I'm so glad that you've given women like me this platform to be able to, get our message out for visibility, and because we don't get the same type of media that other candidates get. And so this is such a way to help break down those barriers.
I appreciate that, Cori. We gotta stick together, and when they say solidarity, it's not solidarity exclusive to your priorities. It's real solidarity. Cori, you've been running really since I've known you nonstop. You ran the second time around in the midst of a presidential election. You ran around the country campaigning for Bernie Sanders. You've put so much on the line for your community, knowing very well that you're running against a family, literally a family, a man who's been there for 20 years. His father was there before. They're an institution.
Yes.
And, most folks would say, listen, can't challenge that. You can't challenge the institutional power. Why is it that you originally decided to run and continue to run despite all of the obstacles that they presented and pushed on you along the way?
Yeah. So being someone that has gone through so much that I feel could have been different for me. Like, I feel like my life could be different had change happened in our communities. If we had somebody that was pushing for the things that are affecting regular folks, and especially marginalized communities, and what's happening in my urban community. And so just continuing to go through situation after situation, knowing that there is another life. Like, we hear about it, how do I get there? And then we have people who even look like us that are allowing us to continue in these situations, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. I think back to when I was first asked to run for office. So coming out of the Ferguson uprising, being a part of that whole movement, leading protests, or doing a lot of organizing there. And then I started traveling around the country as part of the Truth Telling Project, which I am a co-director and co-founder of, just traveling around the country, making sure that the right word was going out about Ferguson, because the narrative was terrible. We're not terrorists. We are change makers, and we were just regular folks that wanted to see our community better. But out of that, I decided, someone asked me to run. May he rest in peace. He's an activist who was murdered. He asked me to run for Senate, for U.S. Senate. Immediately I said no. My dad had been in politics for most of my life. I saw him go through so much hurt, even though he was giving his soul to the community. But when I thought about it, every single time we were on that ground, I'm watching people beaten and brutalized, hung upside down, hogtied, hanging off of a baton, simply because they were using their voices. People beaten just because they stepped off of a curb, and just so many things happened. People missing, people dead, all kinds of things, horrible things. Dogs in our community against us. I'm looking at all of this and thinking about how those elected officials that are paid to represent us, how they weren't standing up for us. They weren't out there. So many of them weren't. I can count on my hand how many were. And the person that's in this seat where I'm running, I only out of 400 and something days that we were out there protesting, I don't remember seeing him but once. And so,
wow.
And so the idea that you can't challenge, this person because he's a machine, because there is this legacy, this loyalty, behind this nostalgia that people have behind this person. We can't be so focused on a person that our communities suffer. Look at what has happened with Senator Sanders. I support Senator Sanders wholeheartedly, and everyone knows that. But he never made this about him. He never made this about himself. He said, not me, us. And in the same way, that same movement is in me, it's in so many others. And that's what it's about. And so I don't want anybody, we shouldn't be following after this one person because that family has held this seat for all of this time. St. Louis is number one, number two for homicides, violent crime, and so many other issues. That's not okay.
I mean, when you say it from that perspective, what is the power that they've had over other people from challenging them? I mean, yes, they control the machinery of politics, but when you have physical uprisings happening all around you and the numbers are in, number one, number two for homicides, for crime, whatever it is that they put out there, there's a point where, as we're seeing nationally, where like that just doesn't work anymore. And why did it take so long for people to really see and contextualize what's happening in St. Louis and that the buck stops at the leadership?
Yeah, people had, there have been people challenging, but for people to support that challenge was hard. Because I'll say this, with the congressman's father moving into that seat in 1969, that was a huge deal, for a Black man to win that seat in 1969, so we understand. And then people will talk about how great of a leader, civil rights activist he was. So I can understand that. But he is no longer in that seat. And so it took, I think even now, even when I ran in 2018, there were a lot of people who felt like, why would you challenge? But this time around, when we started knocking doors for this race back before COVID and, making phone calls since COVID, people are no longer saying that. We're no longer hearing, why would you challenge? We're hearing, oh, it's time. It's time for something different. Because the thing is, even in the midst of COVID-19 and me being sick, this team still kept moving. I was doing what I could, after my first race, when I was brutally, I was violently sexually assaulted. I was raped right after that. I took some time off to collect myself, but then I got right back out there. Not saying everybody has to or everybody should, or we should look down on people who can't. That was my road. And so I'm just that person. So I'm that person that will go to Congress, and no matter what is going on, I'm not caring about whether I'm popular to anybody. I care about, did my district get what they needed? Did our nation move towards, where is that arc bending toward? Is it bending toward justice right now? Am I helping with that? That's what this is about. And so people are seeing it now, and they're saying, enough is enough. We're ready.
Can you talk a little bit about some of what you've experienced over the last few years, personally, financially? I mean, one of the things that I think all of the matriarch candidates are dealing with is, I don't think the public really gets it, that when you run for office, you're most likely not working because it's a full-time job. If you are, that's very hard. You've got bills to pay. And unless you're independently wealthy, there's a reason why all these millionaires and billionaires are in office, because they can afford to, and they're protecting everyone. So, I don't know how much you're willing to share, but what could you express that you've personally experienced while running, before running, you've put on the line, and that you can take with you into Congress as a message to most people so they understand what it means, what sacrifice it took for you to run?
Sure. So I'll start with the place where I was financially before I ever said yes to running for office. So that plays a role. So it's not like I said, like, this is a goal of mine, so I'm going to set my life up to be able to do this later, that it just came from out of nowhere to run. So I was already a single parent, not really receiving any child support. I'm just, trying to make ends meet on my own, had college debt, and, so just trying to survive, already. And then, credit issues because I got into the payday loan, cycle, just trying to survive. And so when I decided to run for this seat, we had been protesting for over a year. So I spent a lot of time, any extra time I had, not extra time, any time I had, I was in Ferguson on the street or somewhere in St. Louis or somewhere protesting. And so there wasn't like extra money. It wasn't like I was working a second job, getting more money. Yeah. So when I decided to run, when I said yes to run for the seat, gosh, I was still working full time. I was the nursing manager of a clinic, or the director, one of the two, of a mental health clinic, and I had to work. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have the money to run. I didn't have the option to be able to take off and allow my campaign to pay for my pay me a salary. I could not, because we weren't raising the money, of course. But I had to pay. I'm the total breadwinner in my household. My children were smaller. So I remember that there were days where, hoping I could put a bill off. Yeah. I'm calling around. Can I pay you next month? Can I pay you in a few weeks? Borrowing money, coming home and my electricity is turned off. There were days when I had to figure out, how am I going to pay the rent this month? I would take money, my personal money, and I'm trying to do things for the campaign, even though I didn't have the money. It was really difficult. And I'll say this, my very first race, the day of the primary election, after I found out I lost, and after the watch party, someone drove me home, and I remember I pulled up at my house and I'm looking like, where's my car? My car was gone. My car had been repossessed, and then the second time around when I ran, I was a little bit better because I had been through it. So I knew where mistakes could be made. So I tried to do a lot better. Yeah. The issue is I was still coming off of that. And I was coming off of not working for 4 months because I had come through that sexual assault. So I didn't work. So I started off in a bad position financially again. But then I had days where it was like, you're so busy on the campaign. I paid my electric bill twice and didn't pay my gas bill, came home to no gas, on in my home. So we had no heat, that type of thing. People don't understand, while you're trying to campaign, people expect you to look a certain way. Mm-hmm. You have to be on this and that, you always have to be camera ready. I would get, Nomiki, I would have people say to me, how dare you come to this event in your scrubs? You look so...
You're a nurse. You're an actual nurse.
I just left a 12-hour shift or a 10-hour shift. I came straight here trying to get here, and you're saying that I shouldn't have come in my nursing uniform. And so it's that type of thing. So I was going to the thrift store to purchase blazers and slacks to be able to... Yeah. And blouses to be able to campaign.
And imagine, if a doctor was running, they would, yeah, exactly. In scrubs. It's just context, right? Uh-huh. Cori, this is so important for people to understand. And I don't think everyone gets it. I don't think progressive lawmakers get it. That every step of the way when you're running, you are sacrificing something. And then as you get closer, as you are right now, you start getting the hits from the establishment. And so this is why, I personally feel, and this is, something we're going to reiterate over and over, why progressive lawmakers need to endorse early, why organizations need to endorse early, because candidates need, number one, some protection, some backup, right? People out there defending them, because a candidate can't defend every attack coming at them, and also helping them raise money. When somebody like a Bernie Sanders endorses you, money comes in, but if it's in the last month, and I'm obviously it's wonderful that he endorsed you, imagine having that money early so you can build the infrastructure, have the team, because you're at the same time competing with a machine that is full of money from who knows where, and they're using it to build their brand, get their message out, and attack you.
Exactly. And they're doing this with more name recognition straight out the gate, right. And also the, with some of these organizations. I'm really glad that you brought that up because, when a year ago we turned in, our information, our questionnaires for endorsement, and have started talks with different groups for endorsement, to even now still be waiting, and I understand that there's this process, and I understand, that things may, that there may be issues, and there are candidates that should be endorsed before us, but we have to get to a point to where we see that, hey, well then on the front end, let's do something different, because just because my campaign is later, it doesn't mean that I don't need the help earlier. I still need the help, because then we get to the end like this, and then we have a lot of groups saying, hey, we want to endorse, but we're about to head into our GOTV. We could have used that help earlier, because the other thing is, how are you marketing yourself? Do we have money to do marketing? Do I know how to brand myself? Like things like that would have helped, so much earlier, especially when you're fighting name recognition. Even though we aren't fighting it as much, I'm still fighting the Cori the protester name recognition thing, which was the whole situation, now, but with Knock Down the House, with the film that I'm in, it kind of helped break that down. So people see me a little more, it humanized me, but we need people to look at us and see that, hey, this is the group that doesn't have the access. So, and that's why we're doing it, is because they don't have the access, but, we just got to do this thing differently.
Cori, there's a global uprising happening, national uprising happening, and it seems to be moving the needle on who's more sensitive to the extraordinary abuses by the police and racism and murders, but also just like the systemic issues that Black people have faced for generations in this country since arriving to the Americas, and then also what it means to protest. And so I'm very curious how, based on what you just said, a few years ago, people saw you as a protester, but now is this conversation, is it okay to be a protester running in your district? Are people now warming up to the fact that, oh wait, this is how we have made change in this country over and over and over again? It's been voices like you standing up to the status quo, standing up to the establishment, standing up to big money. Are you feeling that? Like as you're campaigning in COVID, but are you feeling that?
Yes, I'm feeling that because, before we had so many people that were like, it was the get out of the street, and, get a job, that whole thing. And, or people that just weren't saying anything. Right. And then when Donald Trump, when he won, then it turned into, there was this whole other group that came out and it's like, oh, we're sorry. We realized that we made a mistake during Ferguson. We weren't there for you because we didn't understand, because we weren't as directly affected. Now we're more affected. So now we see, and, we want to help. But still, there was no no real movement, no real mobilization, behind our efforts. But now, that's completely different. Everybody and their cousin, is out protesting, wanting to show that they're protesting. Protesting isn't a curse word anymore. It's not like, you are the rebels and the people that are going to, burn everything down. Now it's like, you are the change makers. Now people are seeing it like that way. You are the change makers and I have to be a part of this change. People are feeling it. People are feeling that something is happening. And yeah, it took these stairs. It took something being built to get here. But just like my auntie that I love, I like to call her my auntie, Dr. Angela Davis. She was I just saw an interview with her and she was talking about how she feels that this is the time, just watching this global uprising, behind, just completely overhauling our policing system and, and really having justice for Black people in this country. Just seeing that means so much, because that means that there are people, because she saw a different thing in her day, a much different thing in her day, but she pushed, yes, and she pushed past that thing, but the other thing is she is of a different generation, and so now we have people that are like, so there's this generational, those silos that were there before during 2014, during Ferguson, broken. You know, the different religions that believed a certain thing, didn't believe a certain thing, broken. You know, whether regardless of if you're, you know, LGBT or you're whatever, and all of that is being broken. It has just been torn down now. You know, everybody is feeling like they should stand up for justice. Or, and I'll say this, I believe that the group that is silent is really, really small. So you're either for, you know, progress, change, and doing anti-racism work, or you are not, and you are doing oftentimes the other work.
Yeah, and it happens on the Democratic side. I mean, we talk about these institutions, and you mentioned this, that you're running against a family, an establishment family, that under their leadership, things have only gotten significantly worse. And we have to have a reckoning in the Democratic Party that our leadership is not just, you know, I hear this rhetoric coming from folks like, well, Joe Biden's you know, he works with Republicans. Right now, from my perspective, what that signifies is, oh, you're working with the people who are on the side of the white supremacists, that are justifying it any single way that they want. And George Bush can get up there and he can talk about how he, you know, stands with BLM and he's voting for Joe Biden. That doesn't seem hard to vote for Joe Biden. How about all these Iraqi children that you bombed? Like, who were you in your worst moments? Who were you when you sat down and you negotiated with Republicans? It's one thing to co-sign on a bill, but it's another thing to say, I will work with them and I will take their votes. And so I think what you made it so clear, so clear. That silence, that neoliberal branding exercise is a wink and a nod to the worst members of the Republican Party that are guiding the Republican Party and beholden. They're holding, you know, they're guiding Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is guiding all of the moderate Republicans. So go ahead.
Silence is violence against my person. It's violence against my skin, you know? And so we can't have people, whether they are Democrat, Republican, Green Party, Libertarian, whoever you are, we can't have them being silent right now in this. But anybody who is of now, you know, anybody who is of influence, anybody who is of power right now in this moment should be very careful as to how they step into this moment or step out of this moment. Because number one, we're watching and history is recording you. That's number one. Number two, what you did yesterday is recorded, and we see what you did yesterday. We are not ignorant. We can see it and we know. So unless you are going to fix that, make up for, tell us, you know, explain that work and tell us how you're going to use your mistakes from that to change and then do something different now, then we don't need to hear. Then stand where you were standing. You know, don't jump. We don't need people jumping in because now Black Lives Matter and saying your Black Lives for Black Lives Matter is the thing. Look, we lost lives. We have there are people I protested with that lost their lives fighting for this. I could have lost my life on that ground out there. You know, I remember seeing the stars come into my face and then the ground come into my face, you know, and then getting stomped by, you know, several police officers with these steel-toe boots. I could have lost my life. My daughter, the bullet went through back of my car, through my back seat, and it disappeared somewhere between the back seat and the front passenger seat. Had it gone through, it would have hit her in the back of her spine. We could have lost our lives while people are out here trying to be a part of what's popular now. No, be a part. Black lives were still Black lives back in 2014, back in 1865, back in 1619, back in 1565. We were still somebody then. So you should have stood up for that. People should have been standing up for us through all of this time. So don't jump on the bandwagon now saying that I want to do something when your yesterday shows us the opposite, unless you will make account for it. Anybody can evolve. So if you want to make account for it, because if you tore up Iraqi children and broke those people, fix that. Because those are still kids. Those are still families. Fix that. If Joe Biden and what he did with this crime bill, I lost so many friends to that. I lost so many friends, and I'll never forget it. Never forget it. Some who are still in prison today. Unless he can make a true account for it, then save the BLM. We need to know, because I need you to be my president. I need to know that you will represent me, because I'm here because you didn't. I'm in this place right now. My friends that I can name them right now are in prison right now because you didn't. So with the same vigor and the same tenacity that you had to push that forward that first time around, have that same vigor and tenacity to fix it and make sure Black folks are free in this country.
Cori, we need you as president. Your race is, what day is your race, your election?
August 4th.
August 4th. You had a violent incident yesterday. I just want to wrap up with this because I don't know what else to say. I think you just spoke for so many people so powerfully, and it's why we believe in you and we love you, and we need to get you elected because we need your voice in Congress, because that voice is going to echo, and they're going to feel it to their bones. That's the problem. They don't want they don't want your voice in their face, calling out their legacies, their histories being like they never want to see what they've created, what the problems they've created head on. It's why Nancy Pelosi pulls open her ice box and pulls out ice cream rather than, even going to hospitals to understand Black and brown communities being faced with COVID more, which she's been able to perpetuate. So you tweeted something out yesterday that you found bullet holes in your car, and you just mentioned another situation, because it's not the first time this has happened. Can you talk a little bit about that before we wrap up?
Sure. Yeah, I just don't know what happened. I heard the gunshots, and it was just really aggressive. The gunshots were really aggressive, and I didn't realize that the car was hit until I tried to drive off in it, and the car wouldn't move. And I didn't even notice that the on the other side of the car that the door handle had been hit. I just, I live in the community that is my community. I live where the people are that have the need, even though there are needs everywhere. I'm with my folks, and so whatever they're going through, I'm going through too, change has to happen from within. And so I'm within, and I'm not going to run. I'm still going to stay out there. Just like when all of those things happen, my car has been shot up. I've had different cars shot at, over the last several years, just being an activist. And I didn't back down then, and I'm not going to back out now. I'm going to change it.
Cori, let's get you elected.
Yes.
Let's get you elected. There's a few more months. People can go to your website, which we'll have up here, to sign up to volunteer. Give money, of course. They need the dough. That's how we're going to take you over the finish line. We're going to send shockwaves to Congress, and then your voice is going to melt those white supremacist statues
Yes.
sitting in Congress, and then we're going to form one. I love you, Cori.
I love you too, Nomiki.
You're so dear to my heart.
Oh.
Let's get you elected. You are listening and watching The Nomiki Show. Make sure to click subscribe and like and share to get those alerts on YouTube. And if you are not already, please join us on Patreon. It's our patrons who make this show happen. We are an independent media channel. What that means is that we don't have corporate stakeholders pushing us through the algorithms. We're not getting the likes and shares through bots. You guys are what makes this show function. So please, we invite you to join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. This past week, Georgia had a primary. Georgia, if you recall, has been the center of many electoral scandals for voter suppression. Surprise, surprise. In America, we do not have a full democracy still. Well, this election on Tuesday turned out to be a major debacle. There were long lines, there were missing voting machines, and there are thousands, tens of thousands of votes in specific districts that have not been counted still. Well, Jennifer Cohn has been on Georgia's butt for the last few years. She
Nice
has
nice
been aggressively advocating for electoral reform. She is an attorney, she's an election integrity advocate, and she's also a writer. Jennifer, thank you so much for jumping on so that we can clarify what's going on in Georgia. First off, do we have any sense of where the election, is this a valid election?
Well, that's a difficult question. In America, the only way to know for sure if an election outcome is legitimate, if you're using electronics, which we do in the United States, is to use hand-marked paper ballots and do a robust manual audit of those hand-marked paper ballots, or a full manual recount of those hand-marked paper ballots and compare it to the electronic total. We don't really do that in the United States. So in that sense, it's hard to know if any of our elections are legitimate, which is really unfortunate to say this close to a national election. I actually started saying this back after I figured it out myself, soon after the 2016 election, and was hoping we could fix it so I wouldn't have to be saying that very unsettling news right before another big election. So, I mean, I'm not really sure exactly how to answer that. There were significant problems with this election above and beyond the, lack of a robust manual audit and lack of a manual recount that could call into question the legitimacy of it. But we have that all the time in the United States, unfortunately.
Were we with a better system when it was all paper ballots? I mean, it's hard to say given that politics is politics and there's still going to be corruption in politics. But would you say that it was safer when we had paper ballots?
I mean, I'm not sure because I wasn't around then, and oftentimes what's reported in the mainstream media is different than the reality on the ground. Mm-hmm. So the gold standard for election integrity is hand-marked paper ballots, but you can have a completely invalid election with those too if they're counted behind closed doors, or if that manual audit or manual recount comes after an election where the chain of custody of those ballots has not been strictly maintained. So we certainly had the building blocks for a better election system back then, but I really can't speak to how it was or wasn't, whether it was always implemented well and in a non-fraudulent manner or not.
Why did we move towards electronic?
We had the building blocks for it, and we've just sort of continually gone further and further away. So like I said about counting hand-marked paper ballots behind closed doors, the thing is once you use a machine in there, that is sort of by definition a closed door. It's the black box, and it makes it harder to get to that sort of transparency that is needed to make sure that our elections are legitimate.
When and why did we decide to move towards these machine systems, electronic systems, which are not uniform in every state? You have different... I'm not sure exactly when we started using the electronics, but when it really took off was after the 2000 presidential election, which was George Bush against Al Gore and the Hanging Chads. Mm-hmm. So sort of the idea was after that, everyone was in a panic and we needed election reform because it was such a disastrous election, and everyone, well, at least the Democrats were super upset about how it all went down, and the Republicans pretended to be. So this legislation called the Help America Vote Act in 2002 was drafted that allocated billions of dollars for new electronic voting equipment. It was written by a Republican named Bob Ney, who was actually from the state of Ohio that ended up being the swing state in 2004. And conveniently, he was good friends with Jack Abramoff, who was a lobbyist for one of the largest vendors in the United States at that time called Diebold Election Systems. And Diebold was selling these paperless voting machines, which by definition, you can't have a manual audit, you can't have a manual recount. So you can just do whatever you want with the totals, and there's no way to prove that it was a fraud. And so they wrote the act so that it did not include any requirement of any paper whatsoever, just these paperless machines. But the Democrats all went along with it, and I think they kind of got suckered. And I mean, that's being generous. And maybe some of them weren't suckered. I don't know. Steny Hoyer, who's now leader in the House, at least I think that's right, isn't it? Representative. Mm-hmm. He was a co-sponsor of the Help America Vote Act, and he actually joined with Bob Ney and Mitch McConnell and someone else in opposing any kind of paper requirement. Interestingly, to me anyway, and I think to a lot of people, Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer were the only two people who opposed the Help America Vote Act. And Hillary warned at the time
that Republican connected vendors could use these paperless machines to steal elections. So anyway, that's sort of how we got so many touchscreen voting machines. And then there was this big push by election integrity advocates starting almost really right away, and experts, with a lot of resistance from election officials. But there was a big push to move toward paper. And actually there was about 70% of the country does have hand-marked paper ballots, which again, that's at least step one. It's not everything that you need, but it's a start. Another 30% sort of has stuck with these touch screens, and then they try to sort of get around the paper ballot requirement with different types of paper that's kind of crappy and no one looks at and is actually marked by the machine rather than by hand. And here we are. So that's kind of how we got here.
It's fascinating. I mean, my instinct immediately was this became a vendor issue, and anything Jack Abramoff was attached to, and he did go to prison. Let's just remind
right.
If you're too young to remember Jack Abramoff, Google him.
Even I was too young to remember Jack Abramoff, but I certainly know about him now. And he, he's probably only about 10 years older than I am, but his deal was he was a lobbyist, and he went to prison for all kinds of sort of fraudulent, accepting bribes on behalf of these Indian casinos. But what's really interesting, he also, his firm anyway, represented debug election systems in Washington, D.C. And he went to, one of the sort of bribes that was exchanged was with Bob Ney, who wrote the Help America Vote Act. And Bob kept the machines paperless. He kept that requirement out of the act. And they both went to prison, but the bribes that they went to prison for didn't have to do with the voting machines. It's almost like Bob Mueller was sort of the guy in charge at the time, and it's almost like they carved around it. Wow. In the instance. They just didn't want to go there and talk about the voting machine, or maybe they couldn't prove the quid pro quo there for some reason, but it's fairly glaring.
Well, it also, I mean, more recently, at least on the Democratic side, to see a wink, wink, and a nod, nod from the Democrats, for whatever reason, the lobbyists are very powerful. Lobbyists are also make a good case. And so, at that time, if we just look back a few years ago, I mean, there's still people who are on the left who are advocating for internet voting. And I mean... Oh,
it's crazy. It's insane. And, I actually did a thread quite a while ago because people were saying that it was the Democrats who opposed having any kind of paper. And so I actually did a thread. I went back and I looked, and there have been Democrats, like I said, Steny Hoyer. There have been Democrats who opposed paper, but for the vast majority of the opposition has become from the Republicans. So there are some Democrats, but the majority have been in favor of making our elections have more integrity. And the GOP has overwhelmingly, with probably some exceptions there too, but overwhelmingly they have been really the fly in the ointment, giant fly in the ointment.
I mean, it's just interesting because it's like in the primaries now, we saw the whole debacle in Iowa over reforms that were to expand democracy. And it had nothing to do with the actual reform. It had to do with how the votes were counted. And no one, when we were going through reform effort, ever said, put a vendor in charge that...
No, a private vendor owned by private equity, so no one really knows who they are.
Exactly.
Yeah, nobody ever said that. And we actually have and then you have this sort of trusted officials telling the public that our election, or at least they used to, that our elections are too decentralized to allow an outcome altering attack, which is complete hogwash. And there are only two vendors that account for 80% of US election equipment. ES&S is the largest, which has ties to the GOP. I feel fairly comfortable saying that. They've donated $30,000 to them since 2013. And then Dominion Voting is a little more recent. They came to be a presence in the US in 2010. So there's not as much information on them, but they're Georgia's vendor, actually. ES&S was Georgia's vendor, and then there was everyone expected when they replaced their system that they would get another ES&S system, and there were so many sort of corrupt ties between the Georgia Secretary of State and ES&S that there was all this, there was a lot of media attention, and they ultimately went with Dominion. It also has some corrupt ties. Their lobbyist used to be the chief of staff for Governor Kemp from like 2012 to 2015. So they had all their bases covered, but they ended up going with Dominion, and it was a debacle. I don't want to suggest it would not have been a debacle with ES&S. I think it would have. I think it would have been the same thing.
So let's talk about where we are with Georgia. I mean, that is jaw-dropping that the governor and the Secretary of State both had direct ties to the two vendors that, major vendors in America. I'm not surprised. I'm also disgusted. I'm shocked that there haven't been hearings about this in Congress. I think, if we can't, we go overseas, of course, we monitor elections. I've been a part of that. And yet
it's really upsetting and frustrating. So there was a big push to have, because the Democrats have subpoena power in the House, so they actually could get information from these vendors. And Representative Zoe Lofgren, who's the head of the House Administration Committee, actually did hold a hearing with the vendors, and it was so exciting. Everyone was, dying to see them put their hands up in the air like the cigarette company executives, and they did, and it was downhill from there. It was just softball question after softball question, and really didn't get into the meat. No follow-ups. It was ridiculous. They admitted that they make donations through lobbyists. But they really didn't get into how much or where and how prevalent it is. It's actually quite prevalent, and it's quite shocking to those who don't already know about it. And it really was shocking to me, and I've been sort of following it around the country. So like Philadelphia, so there's a new type of voting system that I have been very concerned about for the last 3 years called a universal use ballot marking device. And it's just another touchscreen type of voting machine. And we had such a bad experience with the original touchscreen voting machines. Things like, basically the new ones they look like a touchscreen, but they're an electronic ballpoint pen. So they're not doing anything you can't do with your ballpoint pen. Breakdown en masse, which is one of the things I've been warning about. They create bottlenecks that exacerbate long lines too, even when they're not broken down. And so the ES&S is the largest vendor of these. The Express Vote is probably the most popular. And in Philadelphia, they bought one of the ES&S Express Vote XL is one of their versions. And it was the advocates pushing back, experts pushing back, saying, do hand-marked paper ballots instead. And then sure enough, after they pushed the contract through, it turned out that ES&S lobbyists had made donations to each of the two decision makers. And the city could have voided the contract, but they didn't. They gave a big fine, like, naughty ES&S. And they did slap them with a pretty hefty fine, but they still got the contract, and they still got to.
Unbelievable.
It's everywhere, I think.
Is there
it takes someone to catch it. So like in Philadelphia, I'm sorry interrupting you, but the comptroller there was actually, it was amazing. It was the Philadelphia comptroller, and then it was somebody else, but one of the two had subpoena powers, and they actually used them. And that's just so to figure out, and that's how they found out they got these payments. But they were kind of acting like, oh, we don't care which one. This wasn't a preordained decision. Sickening.
Is there a state that's doing right?
Probably not. I mean, all right, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't be that doom and gloom. I mean, I think Minnesota is maybe doing pretty well. I don't know. I tend to focus on the ones who do it wrong, I suppose. Maybe that's a glass half empty approach, but
it's in terms of model. I mean, you're an advocate for paper ballots. You're an advocate. I mean, what would be a model to advocate for?
Well, one thing I want to say though is we can't just say paper ballots anymore, which is really unfortunate because these vendors who are very profit motivated, obviously a touch screen makes more money for them than hand-marked a pile of paper. So they call these new touchscreen systems paper ballot systems because they do generate a piece of paper, and but the machine is marking it for you, and also the machines can all go down. But the machine is marking it for you, and studies show that no one ever really looks at that paper, especially if, as in Georgia, you've been waiting in line for 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. And on top of that, the only part of that actual printout that's counted as your vote is a barcode, and humans can't read barcodes. Mm-hmm. So it's just a scam. It's not transparent. And so anyway, a lot of places have paper ballots now, but it's a big difference between that and a hand-marked paper ballot. And these new systems will be a problem. And they were a problem in Georgia, for example, and in Los Angeles County, for example. I think they're going to be a problem in lots of places, particularly in those places where, as in Georgia and in Los Angeles County, which had a very similar Georgia-style meltdown, they use a separate type of computer called an electronic poll book that connects either to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or some other network connection. They use that to program an activation card. They put a barcode on that, and then they insert that into the touch screen to activate it and pull up your ballot. What could go wrong, right?
Right.
It's asking for trouble because these electronic poll books are so insecure mean, normally they were used just as bad enough, but they were replacing paper poll books to confirm voter registrations at the polls and to confirm you haven't already voted. But you don't need a computer for that either. So they started using these, and you do need them for early voting. But on election day, when you can't come back again, really, that's it. They're using them on election day too. And so it's just asking for trouble, especially the ones like Los Angeles County, they actually connect with Wi-Fi. So, how hard would it be for someone to get into the power grid and make them all fail, and then everything screeches to a halt? And you don't even have to get into the power grid. You can just have connectivity issues, which they had everywhere in LA, and they had some kind of massive problem with them all over, sort of the more Democratic counties in Georgia. So that was a lot. I'm sorry, but I don't even remember what your original question was.
No, this is. I mean, it's especially they were saying that in particular it was more Democratic counties and counties that have more people of color, which of course goes back to the voter suppression aspect here. I mean, listen, you can be in a state like New York too, where we have paper ballots, but you're purged from the voter roll because the Board of Elections is politically run as well. So, I mean,
right. Unfortunately, the equipment, though, is just too often overlooked by voter protection groups. And I don't know exactly why. I think maybe the GOP did a really good job after the 2004 election, which was Bush versus Kerry, of saying that anyone who suggests that there might be cheating with voting machines is somehow a conspiracy theorist. Anyone who has concern about, really anomalous results is a conspiracy. They did a really good job. So nobody wants, and the Democrats fell for it. And they call people that too. And John Kerry now, like 12 years later, has finally admitted that his own campaign thought that election might have been rigged.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember the night of the election.
Yeah.
And when the Ohio results were coming in, everyone was like, there's something wrong.
And they flipped at the end. They flipped after 11 o'clock at night.
Yep.
And Karl Rove was sort of, the head of the campaign then, I think. I don't know if that was his official title, but he was in practice. And so, yeah, I keep losing your questions. I'm sorry.
No,
but
this is fascinating.
Yeah. So the Democrats don't, so these voter protection groups don't really focus on the technology. And I am hearing correctly a lot of concerns about closed polling places. And I don't want to take away from that. The Voting Rights Act, when the Supreme Court gutted it, in Georgia alone, that 214 polling places were closed. Wow. Just, after the Supreme Court's decision there in 2013. And then because of COVID-19, between March and June, they closed another 80 in Atlanta. It gives them a really good pretext, I think. I mean, maybe some of this obviously was legitimate because poll workers, a lot of whom are older, are concerned about working the polls. So some of it, I'm sure, was absolutely legitimate. But the problem I have with saying it's just that is we did have this incredibly increased vote by mail that could and should have maybe offset that, all those polling place closures, but many people didn't get their mail ballots. And therefore it forced them into the polls. This unnecessarily, overly rigged up with all these electronics that can and do fail, especially in certain areas. And the result was chaos. And it isn't just that everyone's going to say it's just COVID and that it's the Voting Rights Act. And certainly that is part of it. That is a big part of it. But LA County had a very similar experience with the very similar system. And same vendor for the poll books, No Ink. Different vendor for the touchscreen ballot marking devices. But absolute chaos. You had 17,000 people who didn't get their mail ballots in LA. This is before the coronavirus shutdown. So no one was really, I don't even know if I think that coronavirus was probably already sort of out there at that point, but no one was worried about it really here.
Right. It wasn't the quarantine
to do with it. And yeah. And so it was not because of a shutdown, and it was not because of the Voting Rights Act, because California is not one of the states that had those pre-clearance requirements where you had to get special permission to change anything because you had a history of race discrimination. That wasn't California. And yet they had a very similar type of meltdown. I mean, it was epic. So it's large. It is also these machines. It is absolutely also these machines. And so many people overlook that, and I don't get it. I don't pretend that voter purges and polling place closures and all those things are not a problem. But the people who focus on those things pretend the machines aren't a problem.
Interesting. And it's
predictably a problem.
And it's multidimensional. It's
that out, for example. She finally did a show on Georgia, but I have to tell you, they did that show to cover Georgia before they bought the equipment, when it was obvious what was going to happen, that they were going to get these new touchscreen machines. And the history of corruption there is really fascinating and really obvious. And it's really what I heard actually is John Ossoff just won his race. He wasn't, was he running for the Senate?
He's running for the U.S. Senate, yeah.
I think he was, and he actually won, which is huge, because one of my first, well, not because of me, but one of the first articles I wrote, I did it on Medium, and it's been viewed it's by far one of my most popular, had to do with his election against Karen Handel for the Georgia 6th District House of Representatives, which was the first flippable race after Trump won. And it was the most expensive House race of all time at the time.
Yep.
And it was done on these paperless, Diebold / now ES&S. ES&S sort of took over all their Diebold's contracts. But so it was done on those machines, and there was a last second memory card error in Fulton County, which is the largest county, and in the primary, and it switched did it switch the results? Well, it did actually. Yeah, Ossoff was ahead, and then suddenly it flipped, and he was behind. And then I don't think there was a memory card error in the general, but in any event, it was a very suspect. I think even the result in the general was extremely suspect, and he had clobbered in mail ballots, and yet somehow lost on these unviable paperless voting machines. So he's been vindicated now, I guess, which is really great.
We'll see what happens in the general.
If it's right, I just got a text from a friend who said that he won.
It did. I got the alert too, as of the time of this taping. But
so, yes.
We'll see what happens in the general. So Jennifer, what can we do about all this?
Paper. So 2 things. For these new electronic poll books, we need backup paper poll books at every polling place and poll workers trained to use them. And for the new touchscreen voting machines, we need backup hand-marked paper ballots. Those 2 things would make a huge difference.
Jennifer, this is super interesting stuff. I'm sure there's going to be other races. I would love to have you back on to discuss them. We'll be watching Georgia. We don't know the results of many of these races, including a congressional candidate that we've had on, Nabila Islam, who is running to make the runoff, and she's a few hundred votes behind, and they're just starting to break through the mail-in ballots. They're 30,000 to count. So fascinating, our democracy, supposed democracy. Jennifer, thank you, though. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me on to talk.
There are so many people challenging the establishment this time around, and it's one of the most amazing things to see coming from the progressive movement. In my own backyard, there is a race to challenge a sitting congresswoman who has been there for decades. And if you know anything about this district, New York 12, you would know that it is one of the most progressive places in the country. Of course, that's where I live. And I think it's about time that we have a congresswoman, who reflects the progress that's happening in my neighborhood in Astoria and beyond. Lauren Ashcraft, thank you for coming to the show. I just want to say from the top, I am so proud to endorse you, and I'm so excited to get you elected.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to have your endorsement, and just really, really respect all the awareness you raise about the movement. So thank you so much.
Of course. So Lauren, let's talk a little bit about my favorite district in America, New York's 12th district. What inspired you to run? What was the background of your run in this cycle?
Yeah, so I grew up just knowing that the government doesn't pay attention to everyday people and the struggles that we face. And on one side of my family, my grandmother's an immigrant from Japan and faced a lot of xenophobia and racism, which is still very much alive today, as we all know. My grandfather was literally killed by corporate greed in a coal mining accident. My other grandfather fell and unfortunately broke his neck. So he became a quadriplegic, and my family was his caretakers because obviously he couldn't afford to hire one because he lost his income and everything because of his accident. And I just grew up understanding that's how it is. The government isn't there for you, but we have to be there for each other. And, forward a few years down the road, Bernie Sanders had an amazing message talking about how corporate money is muddying our politics. And that really resonated with me. Actually, it took him a few times saying it till I was like, wait.
That's why he says it over and over. Okay.
Yes. I like whenever you've never put the pieces together and then you hear it like 10 times, it's like, wait, everything's a lot more broken than we even think it is.
Right.
And I got really involved in kind of organizing on the ground here in New York City. I was part of organizing the Women's March on New York. And in 2019, because of my background in comedy, I was really honored to MC that march. And I brought Representative Ocasio-Cortez on stage, and I saw that she was able to address the crowd and talk about the Green New Deal. She wasn't even in office yet. She hadn't been sworn in yet, and everybody knew what she was talking about. And I thought to myself, what's come out of my district? What kind of ideas has my representative fought for? And I couldn't think of one. And I thought about all the people like my family that have gone ignored. And I talk to my neighbors, I see them struggling. And now look where we are. In the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a criminal justice crisis, this is what passive leadership looks like, and it's what it has led us to. And I'm reminded every single day why I've gotten into this race. I'm fighting for people like my family, and I'm fighting for people that have gone ignored and oppressed all this time.
This district is, for those of you who aren't based in New York, it's quite an interesting district because you do have more working class families in Queens that have traditionally been pretty working class, what we used to call middle class, at least in New York. And then you have the Upper East Side, which is, if not the most, one of the wealthiest places on the planet. It definitely houses the wealthiest people on the planet. They probably have several homes, but many. And then it carries on to other parts of New York, which are now more and more unaffordable, but used to be, at least when Representative Maloney was in office, used to be more affordable to live in. And so you're running at a moment, at least pre-pandemic, when New York had what they labeled the strongest economy ever, but also what we label, and is true, the starkest income inequality in the country. So when you campaign, and then I guess I would be saying pre-COVID, when you campaign across the district, what are the different kinds of conversations that pop up along the way based on neighborhood, like their concerns?
Yeah, well, I've learned from this campaign that we have to throw any kind of preconceived notions totally out the window, because I walked into a very, very expensive doorman house in the Upper East Side and was expecting to have some difficult conversations. And I literally was invited into somebody's apartment, and somebody that makes more than I will ever see in my life said to me, why don't you guys tax me more?
Huh.
And I was flabbergasted, and I learned to just never have any kind of preconceived notions, because you just don't know what somebody's situation is. That opened my eyes a lot, and they're right, we should. And in Long Island City, I obviously pre-COVID was knocking on doors, and there was a man who suffered from dementia and Alzheimer's, and told me that he had one more month left of rent. And after that, he expected to move under, and he named a bridge. And I walked out of that interaction, and my team worked really hard to connect him to any resources available. But that haunts me every single day. And whenever I think about the fact that we've been represented by the same person for 27 years, and there are people that are experiencing this kind of hardship in our district, in one of the richest cities in the world. And I've had trouble sleeping at night. We've checked in on him. He has gotten connected with the resources that have helped him through this time. But now, in the middle of coronavirus, millions of Americans are losing their jobs. Over 71% of this district rents their homes. And so many people in the district can't pay rent, just like that man that we helped, but we don't have the kind of fighter that's making sure that people don't have to think about what bridge they'll live under. It's horrifying.
Yeah, and I read something the other day saying that they expect 40% of New Yorkers to have not paid their rent for 3 months. New York City, 40%. So pretty jarring numbers, and I expect it's only going to get worse. Lauren, you know, this is the district that was affected by Amazon with the, you know, the fight against Jeff Bezos to bring Amazon to Long Island City. This is a district that has had different forms of gentrification. Partly that's, I mean, giving New York a little bit of understanding how New York, you've had waves of immigrants come in. So it's the most diverse, Queens in particular is the most diverse place on the planet. So if you can process that, you have an entire borough of so many different cultures and backgrounds and immigrants, and you're dealing with an economic crisis like this up against Bezos. So how has the Amazon movement, which was only a little over a year ago, and the movement to protect so many different immigrant groups who have been under patrol by ICE in partnership with Amazon, how has that framed your race?
Yeah, I mean, I look back at the corporate greed that's literally killed members of my family. I look back at the immigrants in my family, and this is all very personal. Today it's Amazon, tomorrow it could be another company that's abusing and exploiting its workers. And this is how billionaires exist. I always like to say, you have not earned $1 billion, you've exploited it. And the fact that Jeff Bezos is well on his way to becoming the world's first trillionaire in the middle of when millions of Americans are losing their jobs, and he has asked for donations so that he can give his workers benefits and time off. It's that's how you become a billionaire, is you cheat people.
Right.
And we haven't taxed him or the billionaire class or these huge corporations their fair share. And when I look at Amazon and what almost happened in Long Island City, which is my neighborhood, I think about the fact that our politicians were so ready to just roll out this red carpet and throw all these incentives at Amazon so that they would come. They want to be here anyway. Yeah. And we have to, as New Yorkers, understand these multinational companies want to be here. So what are they going to do for us? Right. Nobody asked that question. And this quote of them bringing 25,000 jobs to the city, they were literally going to bring 25,000 people to the city. Exactly. And plop them down in the middle of Long Island City and raise the rent prices, and everyone would get smushed into the same subway that's already crumbling. Right. So that I didn't see my representative fight on our behalf. I saw our neighboring district representative fight against that deal, and I'm glad she did, because I don't think that I would be able to afford to live in my district if that had happened.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Long Island City is the fastest growing city in America right now. I don't think people understand. So you have an Amazon headquarters that's plopping down with, which is, I remember saying this before, it's a real estate deal. So what people didn't realize is this Amazon deal happened behind closed doors, which was illegal in New York. You didn't get community support. But then there were council members who approved zoning so that all these high luxury apartments could pop up around Amazon, which were being sold to Amazon workers that you just talked about. So what happens to a community that's there? The community that's already been starved of resources, the community that is living in a food desert, which has, like you just said, you have a subway that's crumbling, that they're already dealing with just basic transportation issues. And then suddenly their cost of living goes up. I mean, if it's affecting everybody, we have a real problem. If it's affecting, it's gone so past the point of I mean, we are so past the tipping point at this point that it's ridiculous to me that we don't see our Democratic lawmakers, because this is New York City, stepping up to such egregious deals. Or
Exactly.
opening up the red carpet to it. I mean, it's not even that. They're signing onto the deals and going to welcoming parties.
Yes. And I just, out of morbid curiosity, looked at a lot of their donations, and Amazon PAC is there. Amazon threw money at a lot of the people that signed their name to the letter, giving them all these incentives. And that's how this works. And it's also why I'm fighting for publicly financed federal elections. And whenever we look at my opponent, who's like, literally, she's like, why are people protesting jobs? I'll tell you why. I've had the privilege of speaking with Chris Smalls, who was fired from his job at Amazon for standing up for the safety of his coworkers. That's why people are protesting Amazon jobs and why we aren't willing to roll out the red carpet for them. Mm-hmm. And whenever you talk about wanting to bring jobs to the district, why aren't you fighting for a federal jobs guarantee? Why aren't you fighting hard for a Green New Deal? Co-sponsoring isn't enough. You have to be advocating every single day, because there is a jobs guarantee as part of that framework. And that's a great way to bring jobs to the district, because people will be working to make sure that we're moving towards 100% renewable energy. That's a win for every single person.
So Lauren, there's a person in the race right now who ran last time, and I have been shocked to hear and see some advertising that has been targeted to me, because I live in the district, between Representative Maloney and Suraj Patel. Suraj Patel ran last time, and it's almost childish. It's like they're running for high school president or something. Yeah. You know, he's going after her for being an anti-vaxxer, which is true, and she's going after him for being creepy because of many things that have happened. So can you just explain a little bit about what's going on with Suraj Patel, why people are resisting supporting him this time around versus last time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that so much talk around this race has been about that kind of, I would call it gossip. And I was just a voter last cycle, and I had a really tough choice to make, as did you and everyone else, because the same thing happened last time, a few days before the race. The comments that are being referenced that Suraj made about an underage woman came up. And as you know, I am a very staunch champion for gender equality and women's rights, and that really rubbed me the wrong way. And on the other hand, I'm running against Representative Maloney because I don't see her as the advocate that our district deserves. Mm-hmm. So I'm really dissatisfied with either of them, hence why I put my hat in the ring. And you're right. I mean, she has supported anti-vaccine legislation and has gone to rallies, and it's not a great thing to have supported that kind of rhetoric. And I do have a problem with the commentary that Suraj has said about underage women. And frankly, I don't see, this is the more important thing, is I don't see a vision from Representative Maloney. Like, what will you do with your next 2 years or 4 years? What is your vision for this district? Because if the last 27 years was your vision, it's not good.
What about Suraj? What is his vision right now for those who might be on the edge or followed him last time around?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, we've been at some of these forums together, and I watch him answer questions in a way that is like, what do you guys want to hear from me? And frankly, I'm not sure what his vision is either.
And I think in Medicare for all, for instance, that's a great litmus test.
Yeah. So on paper, yes, but actually in our last debate, he brought up that he's proposed a compromise called Medicare for Kids. And this is the kind of thing that I fight my own party about, because the Democrats are always trying to figure out how to get more staunch conservatives on board with things that should be considered human rights. Healthcare is a human right. And why are we giving it only to kids when we should be giving it to everyone. And I think back on that man that I spoke with who was afraid that he'd have to live under a bridge. You're leaving people like him out. And you're leaving people like my grandparents out, and you're leaving people like my neighbors out. And I'm fighting for them too. So I don't know why, if you're not even in Congress yet, what are you doing proposing compromises to things that we all deserve?
Well, my guess is he's probably accepting money from folks who are compromised and feeling pressure. He also comes from a very privileged background, correct? That's his, which, you know, there can be privileged people who run and do very good things, but there's been a criticism that he is, you know, putting a lot of his money into this race and comes from that type of money. And I think that's important to to discuss. It shouldn't distract away from politics. But if you have policies and you come from privilege, then that is how you use your privilege. Fight for other people.
Yes.
But if you're using gimmicks and shielding the public from your privilege, which is essentially what I've seen in these, you know, in his campaigning, then I think it's a concern. So
one of the things that we noticed is he does take maxed out donations, and by maxed out I mean double maxed out. So maxed out primary donation of $2,800, and then another maxed out $2,800 for the general election. So that inflates his numbers, and this is something that a lot of candidates do that have connections to people that can just drop $5,600 like that. And that's not something that our campaign has. And I don't have that kind of connection, which is why we are really proud to have earned over six figures of donations from $16 at a time, which is our average donation.
It's fantastic.
And thank you. And I think about the fact that last time he spent both his primary and general funds, but did not win the primary. So the general fund he had to take on as personal debt. So $300,000 his campaign overspent, and that's not a problem for him. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, if your number one goal is to unseat Representative Carolyn Maloney, I would have really appreciated his support. And, you know, we've been working really hard on the ground and knocking on doors since last March, and have just been growing and doing this in a grassroots way. But to come in with, you know, some more maxed out donations and try this thing again and pretend that everyone who didn't vote for him last time will forget the reasons why, like myself. It's all a reminder of why I'm doing this. And I'm fighting for the everyday people that would see my campaign and think, yeah, she can do this. I could do this. And someday I hope more everyday people do challenge me. And that's how democracy should look, as I should always be on my toes and think, you know, the next 2 years, I want to earn my place in Congress. And that seat belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to Representative Maloney. It doesn't belong to anyone but the district. So if I don't see that kind of fight and acknowledgement about the working class people, and about the fact that not all of us can just absorb $300,000 worth of debt, or Representative Maloney loaned herself $100,000 this cycle. Wow. I'm not running up against everyday people. I'm running for everyday people.
Lauren, that's crazy. A sitting member is using her money for her campaign. I mean, it just shows how much she wasn't expecting, even though she's been challenged several times the last few years. This is not her first challenge, and last time was not her first challenge. So it's kind of shocking that she wasn't prepared for this. Mm-hmm. Lauren, where can people learn about your race, and how can they help out? Your primary is June 23rd, for those of you who aren't aware.
Yes. So the last day to request your absentee ballot is June 16th. So it's really important. If you see this, you should vote. Even if it's not for me, but vote for me. June 16th, or do it right now. Go to nycabsentee.com, and it takes literally 20 seconds max. You just have to put in your name and address, and you get your absentee ballot in the mail. Use it, put it back in the mailbox, sign and date on the envelope, and your voice matters, your vote matters. And if you want to help us spread the word, go to act.laurenashcraft.com. And every single day we have shifts where we're reaching out to people of the district on the phone and via text message, if you want to help us do that. And also, we are grassroots, as I've discussed, and I don't have the $300,000 to just dump into my own campaign. So if you like the idea of an everyday person who has the same struggles as you representing this district, then $1 as a donation truly does make a difference, because we have thousands of donors, and together this is a movement, and we are fighting to get true representation in New York's 12th congressional district.
Awesome. Keep up the amazing work, Lauren. Very proud to be working with you and endorsing you. And someday, I'm not saying that like it's quid pro quo, but I hope that when you're in office, you remember and you come back on the show and talk about what it's like to be a progressive in Congress.
Oh my gosh, I thank you. I'm just really honored to have your support, and thank you for using this amazing platform to highlight grassroots progressive women.
Thank you. Thanks to our guests, Jennifer Cohn, Cori Bush, and Lauren Ashcraft, and to Dorsey back in New York, as well as Kelly and George from our team. Until next week, stay safe and be well.